Picture this. It's the year 1315. The first flakes of snow begin to fall in October, and they won't stop until April. The temperature plummets to bone-chilling depths that modern heating systems have made us forget. You're a peasant in medieval Europe, and you're about to face 7 months of a frozen hell that could very well be your last. Your noble lord sits warm in his stone castle, feasting on preserved meats and wine, while you have nothing but your wits, your family, and the ancient wisdom passed down through generations of survivors. This isn't just a story about cold weather. This is a story about the most ingenious, desperate, and sometimes shocking methods that ordinary people used to stay alive. When winter meant death was literally knocking at your door. What you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about medieval life, because the truth is far more terrifying, more brilliant, and more brutal than any Hollywood movie has ever dared to show. Chapter 1. The Great Dying Time. Let's start with the truth that will chill you to the bone. Medieval winters weren't just cold, they were executioners. Between 1315 and 1322, Europe experienced what historians now call the Great Famine. But here's what they don't tell you in textbooks. It wasn't just about crop failures. It was about winters so severe that people literally froze to death in their own homes. Entire families would be found in spring, huddled together in what appeared to be sleep, but was actually their final, desperate embrace against the cold. Imagine waking up one morning and finding ice crystals formed on the inside of your walls. Imagine your breath creating clouds so thick you can barely see your own hand. Imagine knowing that the next 7 months will test every fiber of your being, every survival instinct you never knew you had. But here's where the story gets fascinating and terrifying. Medieval peasants didn't just survive these conditions. They developed techniques so advanced, so clever, that modern survival experts study them today. They turned their entire existence into a calculated battle against death itself. The question isn't whether they were tough. The question is, how did they do what seems impossible? Chapter 2. The architecture of survival. The medieval peasant home wasn't just a house, it was a fortress against winter, and every single element was designed with survival in mind. Let me take you inside a typical peasant dwelling in the dead of winter. The moment you step through that heavy wooden door, you notice something strange. The floor isn't level, it's deliberately built at a slight slope. Why? Because they knew something that modern architects are just rediscovering. Heat rises, but it also flows like water. The ceiling is low, so low that a modern person would have to duck. This wasn't poor construction, this was genius. Every cubic foot of air they heated was precious. A high ceiling meant death. But here's the clever part. The roof wasn't just low, it was designed to trap heat in pockets. The thatch wasn't randomly placed. It was woven in patterns that created insulation chambers. But wait, there's more to this story. The walls themselves were alive. Yes, you heard that right. Medieval peasants would literally pack their walls with living materials. Not just mud and straw, but fermenting organic matter that generated heat through decomposition. They were essentially living inside a controlled compost heap that kept them warm through biological processes. And the windows? There weren't any. At least, not in the way we understand windows. Instead, they had shutters with tiny holes positioned to create air currents that would circulate warm air without letting cold air in. They had mastered airflow dynamics centuries before modern ventilation systems, but the most shocking element was what they did with their floors. Chapter 3. The secret of the living floor. This is where medieval survival techniques get truly bizarre and absolutely brilliant. Medieval peasants didn't just live with their animals for companionship. They lived with them because animals were living heaters. But it goes deeper than that. The floor of a medieval peasant home was actually a carefully engineered ecosystem. Picture this. The bottom layer was stone or packed earth, designed for drainage. Above that, a layer of straw and animal dung, yes, dung, that was constantly being added to throughout the winter. This wasn't primitive mimesis. This was sophisticated thermal engineering. The animal waste would ferment, generating heat through bacterial decomposition. The straw would insulate and absorb moisture, and the animals themselves, pigs, chickens, sometimes even a cow, would live right there in the main room, providing body heat, warmth from their breathing, and yes, more material for the heating system. But here's what will blow your mind. They understood bacterial heat generation. They knew that certain combinations of organic materials would produce more heat than others. They had recipes, actual recipes, for creating the perfect floor mixture that would burn warm but not too hot, for exactly the right amount of time. A master of this technique could keep a room at a survivable temperature for weeks, using nothing but controlled decomposition. They were biochemists, centuries before the term was invented, and when spring came, they would shovel out this mixture and use it as fertilizer for their fields. Nothing was wasted. Every aspect of survival was connected to every other aspect. But the animals weren't just heaters. They were something far more important. Chapter 4. The alliance of the desperate. The relationship between medieval peasants and their animals during winter was unlike anything we understand today. This wasn't farming. This was a survival partnership, forged in desperation and perfected through necessity. Let me tell you about the Winter Pact. When the first hard frost hit, peasant families would literally negotiate with their animals. They would keep the animals alive through winter, sharing their own food when necessary, and in return, the animals would provide heat, companionship, and something far more valuable, early warning systems. Animals sense danger before humans do. They sense temperature drops, approaching storms, and even structural problems with buildings. A restless pig might mean the roof was about to collapse from snow weight. A chicken that stopped laying might indicate that the air quality was becoming dangerous. These weren't pets, they were living environmental sensors. But here's where it gets darker. Medieval peasants also had to make the most brutal calculations you can imagine. Which animals would make it through winter? Which ones would need to be sacrificed to keep the others alive? These decisions weren't made randomly. They had complex formulas based on body size, heat generation, food consumption, and survival probability. And sometimes, in the deepest, darkest part of winter, when all other options were exhausted, the animals provided one final service. But let's talk about food first. Because medieval winter food storage wasn't just about preservation, it was about creating edible chemistry sets that could sustain life when nothing else could. Chapter 5. The Alchemy of Starvation. Medieval peasants didn't just store food for winter. They transformed it into entirely new substances that could keep them alive when normal food would have rotted, frozen, or simply run out. This is where medieval survival techniques become almost supernatural in their sophistication. Take bread, for example. You think you know what bread is. Medieval winter. Bread wasn't food, it was edible building material. They would bake loaves so hard they could be used as bowls, tools, even weapons. These breads would last for months, slowly softening when soaked in whatever liquid they could find. But here's the secret. They weren't just flour and water. Medieval winter bread contained sawdust, ground bark, crushed bones, and sometimes even clay. This wasn't because they were desperate, though they often were. It was because they understood nutrition in ways we're only beginning to rediscover. The sawdust provided fiber. The bark contained vitamins. The bones provided calcium and marrow nutrients. The clay helped with digestion and provided essential minerals. They were literally eating the forest, and they had scientific reasons for every ingredient. But bread was just the beginning. Let me tell you about preservation techniques that would make modern food scientists jealous. They would bury meat in snow mixed with specific types of salt, creating natural freezing chambers that kept meat fresh for months. They understood that different salts worked at different temperatures, and they had formulas for salt mixtures that would preserve food at specific temperature ranges. They made alcohol that wasn't for drinking. It was liquid medicine that could cure infections, numb pain, and provide calories when no other food existed. They had recipes for alcohols made from anything that could ferment, spoiled grain, frozen fruit, even tree sap. And then there were the emergency foods, the foods they hoped they would never need but always prepared. Chapter 6. The foods of last resort. What I'm about to tell you might disturb you, but remember, this is about survival when the alternative was death. Medieval peasants had emergency food supplies that modern people can barely imagine consuming. They called them famine foods, and they were prepared with the understanding that they might be the difference between life and death. They would dry and powder everything. Tree bark became flour. Acorns became protein-rich meal. Grass became vitamin-rich supplements. But the process wasn't simple. Each of these foods required specific preparation to make them safe and nutritious. Acorn flour, for example, had to be processed through multiple washings to remove toxic tannins. They had perfected techniques for leaching these toxins that took weeks of careful water changes. They were essentially performing food chemistry. Without understanding the science behind it, they made soups from bones that had been buried in snow all winter. They knew that frozen bones would soften differently than fresh bones, and they had techniques for extracting every possible nutrient from what others would have considered waste. But perhaps most shocking of all, they prepared for cannibalism, not because they were savage, but because they were practical. They had rules, rituals, and procedures for consuming the dead when absolutely no other option existed. These weren't random acts of desperation. They were carefully considered survival protocols that included spiritual preparations and health precautions. Historians rarely discuss this aspect of medieval life, but the evidence is clear in surviving documents. They knew which parts of the human body provided the most nutrition, how to prepare human flesh safely, and how to psychologically cope with crossing this ultimate survival boundary. The fact that we have detailed records of these procedures tells us something profound. They survived. They made these impossible choices and lived to document them for future generations. But food was only part of the equation. The psychological challenge of medieval winter survival was perhaps even more demanding. Chapter 7. The Battle for Months of winter darkness. 7 months of constant cold. 7 months of uncertainty about whether you'll see spring. Medieval peasants didn't just survive physically. They had to survive mentally. That he developed psychological techniques that modern psychiatrists study as examples of extreme resilience training. First, they understood that isolation kills faster than cold. Medieval peasant communities developed elaborate social rituals specifically designed to maintain mental health through winter. They had storytelling competitions that lasted for days. They had riddle contests, memory games, and group activities that kept their minds sharp and their spirits connected. But here's what's really fascinating. They created artificial purposes. They would set themselves elaborate, seemingly pointless tasks that had to be completed before spring. Carving intricate patterns into wood, weaving complex textiles, creating detailed tapestries that told stories. These weren't busy work. They were psychological survival tools. They understood that the human mind needs goals, accomplishments, and forward progress to maintain sanity. So they created artificial achievements that could be completed even when trapped indoors for months. They also developed meditation techniques, though they didn't call them that. They had prayer routines, breathing exercises, and mental focusing practices that helped them cope with claustrophobia, depression, and anxiety. Some of these techniques were remarkably similar to modern mindfulness practices, but perhaps most importantly, they mastered the art of hope management. They created calendars, not just to track time, but to create psychological milestones. They celebrated microseasons, the day when daylight lasted 1 minute longer, the day when the snow stopped falling, the day when they could hear birds again. Each small victory was treated as a major triumph, because they understood that hope was a limited resource that had to be carefully rationed and strategically deployed. And when hope wasn't enough, they had darker methods. Chapter 8. The Dark Arts of Winter Survival. Medieval peasants practiced forms of survival that we would consider witchcraft, medicine, and psychology all rolled into one. When conventional methods failed, they turned to techniques that blurred the line between science and magic. They used controlled hallucinations. Yes, you heard that right. They would consume specific combinations of herbs and fungi that would alter their consciousness in ways that made winter more bearable. These weren't random drug experiments, they were carefully calculated psychological interventions. Certain mushrooms, when prepared correctly, could create warming sensations even when the body was actually cold. Specific herb combinations could induce sleep states that allowed them to essentially hibernate through the worst parts of winter, conserving energy and reducing food consumption. They practiced what we would now call therapeutic hypothermia. They understood that slightly lowering body temperature could make limited food supplies last longer, and they had techniques for safely inducing and controlling mild hypothermia states. But perhaps most remarkably, they practiced group hypnosis. Community leaders who had mastered these techniques could guide entire families through shared trance states that made time pass more quickly and pain more bearable. These sessions weren't considered magical, they were considered essential survival skills. They also used fear as a tool. They would tell terrifying stories about winter demons, frost giants, and ice spirits. This wasn't primitive superstition, it was sophisticated psychological conditioning. By externalizing the danger of winter into mythological threats, they could better cope with the very real threat of death. The fear of imaginary monsters was easier to handle than the fear of slow starvation or freezing to death. So they created elaborate mythologies that gave them psychological frameworks for understanding and coping with their situation. And when spring finally came, they had rituals for that too. Chapter 9. The Resurrection Protocols. Surviving winter was only half the battle. Medieval peasants also had to survive the transition back to normal life, and this was more dangerous than most people realize. After months of limited food, reduced activity, and survival mode psychology, the human body and mind couldn't simply snap back to normal function. They had developed elaborate resurrection protocols, systematic methods for safely returning to regular life. First, they understood that their digestive systems had adapted to winter foods. Returning to normal foods too quickly could cause serious illness or even death. They had specific dietary transition schedules that gradually reintroduced normal foods over periods of weeks. They knew that their muscles had weakened during winter, so they had exercise routines designed to safely rebuild strength without causing injury. These weren't random activities, they were carefully structured rehabilitation programs. But perhaps most importantly, they had psychological transition rituals. They understood that 7 months of survival mode created mental habits that were helpful for winter but harmful for normal life. They had to consciously reprogram their thinking, their risk assessment, and their social behaviors. They held community ceremonies that officially ended winter survival mode and began normal life. These weren't just celebrations, they were group therapy sessions that helped everyone process the trauma of winter survival and transition back to normal social functioning. And they prepared for the next winter. Even while celebrating survival, they were already planning, already learning from what had worked and what hadn't. already preparing for the next test of their survival skills because they knew something that we often forget. Survival isn't a one-time event. It's a continuous process of adaptation, preparation, and resilience. Chapter 10. The techniques that changed everything. Now, let me share with you some specific techniques that were so effective, they literally changed the course of history. The three-fire system. Medieval peasants never relied on a single heat source. They always maintained 3 different types of fires: a cooking fire, a heating fire, and an emergency fire. Each had different fuel requirements, different maintenance needs, and different purposes. If one failed, they had backups. But more importantly, the 3 fires created air circulation patterns that distributed heat more efficiently than any single large fire could. The body heat network. In the coldest parts of winter, entire families would sleep in carefully orchestrated positions designed to maximize shared body heat. This wasn't random huddling, it was engineered thermal management. Larger people on the outside, smaller people in the middle, positioned to create warm air pockets and prevent heat loss. They had different sleeping formations for different temperatures, different group sizes, and different health conditions. The breathing cave. They would create small, enclosed spaces within their homes, essentially caves made of fabric, wood, and insulation where they could retreat when temperatures became life-threatening. These spaces were just large enough for 1 or 2 people, and they were designed to be warmed efficiently by nothing but body heat and breath. A person could survive in a breathing cave for days using no external heat source. The food timing protocol. They didn't eat meals at regular times during winter. Instead, they ate according to temperature and activity patterns. Hot foods when temperatures were dropping, cold foods when temperatures were stable, and specific nutrient combinations based on their current physical condition. They had essentially created personalized nutritional protocols that maximized energy efficiency. The warning systems. They developed environmental monitoring techniques that allowed them to predict weather changes, structural problems, and resource shortages days or even weeks in advance. They watched animal behavior, air pressure changes, and subtle environmental indicators that most people never notice. They were essentially human weather stations and early warning systems. But perhaps most impressively, Chapter 11. The secret they never shared there was one technique that medieval peasants mastered but rarely spoke about, even among themselves. It was considered so dangerous, so powerful, and so necessary that it was only taught in the most extreme circumstances. They learned how to die temporarily. This sounds impossible, but the evidence is clear in medical records from the period. Medieval peasants developed techniques for entering death-like states that could last for hours or even days. Their breathing would slow to nearly undetectable levels. Their heart rate would drop dramatically, and their body temperature would fall to barely survivable levels. But they weren't dying. They were entering controlled hibernation states that allowed them to survive conditions that would normally be fatal. They could reduce their caloric needs to almost nothing, eliminate the psychological stress of extreme discomfort, and essentially wait out the worst parts of winter storms in near-death states. The technique required years of practice, careful preparation, and usually the assistance of someone who had mastered the skill. It was dangerous. People did die attempting it, but for those who mastered it, it was the ultimate survival tool. They called it winter sleeping, but it was far more sophisticated than sleep. It was controlled, reversible, temporary death. And the fact that some people could do this suggests that human survival capabilities are far more advanced than we currently understand. Medical researchers are only now beginning to study these historical accounts and attempting to understand how such techniques might have been possible. Some believe it involves specific combinations of herbs, breathing techniques, and psychological conditioning. Others think it might have been a form of hypothermia that somehow avoided permanent damage, but the medieval peasants who practiced this technique took their secrets to their graves. We have evidence that it existed, but the knowledge of how to do it has been lost. Chapter 12. The price of survival. But survival came with costs that we can barely imagine. Medieval peasants didn't just endure winter, they were changed by it permanently. The physical changes were obvious. Years of winter survival left bodies that were incredibly resilient but also damaged in specific ways. Joints that had been stressed by extreme cold, digestive systems that had adapted to survival foods, immune systems that had been both strengthened and weakened by constant exposure to threats. But the psychological changes were more profound. People who had survived multiple medieval winters thought differently. They assessed risk differently. They valued resources differently. They related to other people differently. They developed what modern psychologists would recognize as a form of survival-based PTSD, but it was PTSD that had been integrated into a functional worldview. They were simultaneously more anxious and more confident, more fearful and more courageous, more pessimistic and more determined. They knew things about human nature that most people never learn. They knew exactly what they were capable of when everything was at stake. They knew which of their neighbors could be trusted in life or death situations and which couldn't. They knew the precise point at which civilization ended and pure survival began, and they knew that they could cross that line and come back. Most people live their entire lives wondering if they could survive extreme circumstances. Medieval peasants knew they could because they had done it repeatedly. This knowledge made them formidable in ways that extended far beyond winter survival. They were the people who built cathedrals, launched crusades, and eventually created the Renaissance. They were people who had been tested by conditions that would break most modern humans, and they had not only survived, they had thrived. Chapter 13. The Final Secret. But here's the most shocking truth about medieval winter survival. It wasn't the techniques that made the difference. It wasn't the food storage, the heating systems, the architectural innovations, or even the psychological methods. That it was the acceptance of mortality. Medieval peasants survived because they had made peace with the possibility of death. They planned for survival, they fought for survival, they used every technique and tool available to them. But they had also accepted that they might not make it, and that acceptance freed them to focus entirely on the process of survival without being paralyzed by fear of the outcome. Modern people often fail in survival situations not because they lack techniques, but because they can't psychologically accept that they might die. They waste energy fighting the reality of their situation instead of adapting to it. They make poor decisions because they're motivated by denial rather than acceptance. Medieval peasants understood that survival required embracing death as a possibility while refusing to accept it as inevitable. This paradox, simultaneously accepting and rejecting mortality, gave them a psychological advantage that was perhaps more important than any technique they developed. They could make the hard decisions because they had already accepted the hardest possible outcome. They could take calculated risks because they weren't paralyzed by worst-case scenarios. They could endure suffering because they understood it as a temporary price for a precious goal. And when spring came, they didn't just celebrate survival, they celebrated the fact that they had been tested by the ultimate challenge and had proven themselves worthy of life itself. Chapter 14. The Modern Connection. So, what does this mean for us today? Why should modern people care about medieval winter survival techniques? Because we're not as different from medieval peasants as we think we are. Our central heating, our grocery stores, our modern conveniences create an illusion of security that can disappear faster than we imagine. Natural disasters, economic collapse, infrastructure failures. Modern people can find themselves in survival situations with very little warning. But more importantly, medieval peasants understood something about human potential that we've forgotten. They knew that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary survival feats when they're properly prepared, mentally conditioned, and willing to make hard choices. They proved that intelligence, determination, and community cooperation can overcome seemingly impossible odds. They demonstrated that human beings are far more resilient, adaptable, and resourceful than our comfortable modern lives would suggest. Their techniques weren't just about surviving winter. They were about discovering the absolute limits of human capability and then pushing past those limits through ingenuity, cooperation, and sheer determination. Every time you complain about your heating bill, remember the medieval peasant who kept his family alive for 7 months using nothing but animal heat and controlled decomposition. Every time you worry about food security, remember the people who created nutritious meals from tree bark and grass. Every time you feel overwhelmed by challenges, remember the humans who faced literal death every single winter and found ways to not just survive, but to build civilizations. Chapter 15. The Ultimate Lesson. The ultimate lesson of medieval winter. Survival isn't about techniques or tools or methods. It's about the human spirit's refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat seems certain. Medieval peasants faced conditions that would kill most modern people within days. They had no safety net, no backup plan, no rescue services to call. They had only their intelligence, their determination, and their absolute refusal to give up. And they didn't just survive. They created art, told stories, raised families, built communities, and laid the foundations for the modern world. They proved that human beings can maintain their humanity even under the most dehumanizing conditions. They showed that survival isn't just about staying alive, it's about staying human while staying alive. It's about preserving dignity, compassion, creativity, and hope even when those qualities seem like luxuries you can't afford. They demonstrated that the difference between surviving and thriving isn't just about resources or techniques. It's about maintaining the belief that life is worth living, that tomorrow will be better than today, and that human connections are more important than individual survival. Medieval peasants survived freezing winters not just because they were tough, but because they understood that being human means refusing to let circumstances define your character. They faced the worst conditions imaginable and chose to remain generous, creative, hopeful, and connected to each other. That's the real secret of their survival. That's the lesson that matters more than any technique or tool. That's what we need. To remember when we face our own winters, whatever form they might take, because winter always comes, but spring always follows, and the people who remember that truth are the ones who survive to see it. Closing, the echo of ancient wisdom asks, we reach the end of this journey through medieval winter survival. I want you to think about the people whose stories we've just explored. They weren't heroes in the traditional sense. They weren't warriors, or nobles, or famous historical figures. They were ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances with nothing but their intelligence, their determination, and their refusal to surrender. They created solutions that modern science is still trying to understand. They developed techniques that we're only beginning to appreciate. They survived conditions that would challenge our best modern equipment, using nothing but materials they could find in their immediate environment. But most importantly, they proved something about human nature that we desperately need to remember. We are capable of far more than we think we are. We can adapt to conditions we never imagined facing. We can find solutions to problems that seem impossible. We can maintain our humanity even when survival seems to require abandoning it. The medieval peasants who survived those terrible winters left us more than historical records. They left us proof that human beings are remarkable creatures, capable of remarkable things, when we're willing to embrace both our limitations and our potential. Their techniques may seem ancient and primitive, but their spirit is timeless and essential. In a world that often feels uncertain and threatening, they remind us that uncertainty is not defeat, that threats can be overcome, and that the human capacity for survival, adaptation, and hope is virtually unlimited. The next time you face your own winter, whatever form it takes, remember the medieval peasants, who turned 7 months of potential death into 7 months of determined life. Remember that survival is not just about techniques and tools, but about the decision to keep going when keeping going seems impossible. Remember that you carry within yourself the same intelligence, the same determination, and the same refusal to surrender that allowed ordinary people to survive extraordinary challenges centuries ago. Winter always comes, but spring always follows. And the people who remember that truth are the ones who survive to see it. That's the ultimate lesson of medieval winter survival. That's the gift that these long-dead peasants have given to us across the centuries. That's the wisdom that can carry us through whatever challenges we might face. They survived, they endured, they thrived, and so can we. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most remarkable survival stories. If you found these techniques fascinating, make sure to subscribe for more hidden stories from history. What other survival secrets would you like to explore? Let me know in the comments below.